All right, so quick reminder about the assignments. I think most people are in good shape. There's some people that have not handed in. They've been granted extensions. I think today is actually the due date for the extensions. There are some people that have submitted a draft but have not fully submitted. You have to go into Moodle and you have to press submit. I think there's a little thing you have to agree and hit submit or something like that. So check your emails, because people who fall into any of these categories, I've emailed you. Some people haven't submitted their plagiarism certificate, those kind of things. This is all putting me behind on the grading, unfortunately. My goal is to have them all done in 2 weeks from now. So I think I calculated if I do 4 or 5 a day, I'll be in great shape. I'm just starting to dive into these now. Okay, so if there's any questions or if somebody is really panicking and they want to know their grade sooner than later, let me know and I can try to put you up near the top. That won't be a problem. But I'll do my best to have them done in 2 weeks. Actually, I'm hoping 2 weeks to have them done like the Tuesday, not the Thursday. Anyway, better before the last day of classes. Let's see if I can get. I gotta get some batteries from my mouse apparently. Okay, so let's talk about C. diff for a minute. We were talking about C. diff last day and kind of finished off talking about probiotics and fecal transplants and things like that. And I had this cute little graphic that kind of talks about what's going on with C. diff. So you can see there's C. diff there, and it says it's a common cause of antibiotic-induced diarrhea. And so come on in. So you can see kind of what's happening here is somebody takes antibiotics, it kills your normal flora. C. diff has those endospores and can survive, has a chance to kind of thrive. It releases some toxins, and those toxins cause diarrhea. So we had kind of finished off, I guess I forgot to talk about C. diff, and I had mentioned, one of the treatments for it is something called a fecal transplant, which in a sense is a type of probiotic. So this is kind of just touching base from last lecture, something I guess I forgot to touch on and sort of had it out of order to transition into today. So today we want to talk a little bit about something that C. diff is doing here. C. diff is doing something called an opportunistic infection. And so in terms of what we've been talking about, I want to get into today, why is it that sometimes we have organisms that are benign or commensal or mutualistic, and then they become pathogens? Or why is it that we have some strains, for example, of E. coli, that are good and some strains are bad? So all about this idea of pathogenicity, which is what I want to talk about today. So here's a little cartoon. You can see it says here, when relationships go bad, and just like human relationships, they can change. And this is kind of what opportunistic pathogens are all about. So commensals can become pathogenic under the right circumstances. And so what do these opportunities include? There's a really nice table in textbook that gives a huge list of opportunities, and you can see that I've actually have that listed on the right. So things like AIDS, HIV, antibiotic usage, those kind of things. On the left, what I've done is kind of really just put it into 4 categories. One of the categories is immune suppression. So you could be immunosuppressed for a variety of reasons. You could be malnourished, you could have HIV, you could have measles, maybe you're on immunosuppressants because of an organ transplant, all those kind of things. Number 2 is change in normal flora. So we mentioned the case of C. diff where people have had antibiotics, or sometimes there's a change in normal flora for any number of reasons, right? The third one, introduction of an organism to a new site. So the classic example of that is E. coli is being introduced. It's from your intestine and ends up in your urethra. So this is why we usually teach our children, particularly if they're females, you need to wipe in one direction. You need to wipe away from the anus. Anus away from the urethra, not in the other direction, right? and to prevent bladder infections from E. coli. And then there's a whole list of other complications, things like cystic fibrosis. You can see I have an example there. Cystic fibrosis patients have an extra thick mucus in their lungs, which makes them susceptible to biofilms growing in their lungs, which is obviously not a good thing. And it's something that makes it harder for them to clear bacterial infections from the lungs compared to a normal patient. Like I said, there's a good list in the textbook. I've thrown some of them on there, and some of them just from my own research that I put up there on the right. So like I said, I want to talk about these mechanisms of pathogenicity, and this is kind of the requirements that organisms need in order to actually establish themselves and cause that infection. So pathogenicity, by the way, is basically means the ability to cause disease, because an infection doesn't necessarily mean disease, right? We can be infected by things and we're not necessarily sick, or sometimes we're infected by good organisms. Sometimes the word virulence pops up there as well. Virulence usually means how pathogenic something is in terms of, if something is extremely virulent, it's causing terrible disease, versus something that's mildly virulent causes mild disease. So for example, this new coronavirus, for many people is not very virulent compared to SARS Classic back in 2003, which was very virulent, very high death rates and very severe disease for most people. So that's a word that sort of pops up once in a while. So I'm going to kind of go through each of these and talk about, give you some examples, and kind of go through and try to explain, what all these criteria are, because they're all important and they all lead to the contribution of disease. And some of these variables are more important for some organisms versus others. So let's take a look at this. All right, so the first thing is that in order for an organism to cause disease, it has to get to usually a certain body system. And so often we talk about this in terms of transmission, but it's sort of kind of closely related, like we might talk about the fecal oral route or something like that, or sexually transmitted infections, and so on. And so these things are worth talking about, because of course an organism has to get to a certain body system in order to cause disease. For example, Staphylococcus, if it's on the surface of your skin, it's not usually going to cause you any problems. But if it gets inside your blood, that could be a problem. So one area of portal of entry is called the mucous membranes. So these are linings, epithelial linings that are part of a whole bunch of your body systems. So your urogenital system, your digestive tract, and those kind of things. They have, it's kind of like skin. It's not as many layered. Skin usually has a dead layer on the surface, whereas mucous membranes, you don't have the dead layer, and the cells are literally secreting moisture and mucus, right? So this includes things like the oral route, the respiratory route, and the sexual route. And there's lots of examples of those kind of organisms, right? So oral route, like I said, all sorts of fecal oral diseases. You could have hepatitis A, we could have Salmonella, which leads to digestive disease, and so on. Respiratory route, we have things like influenza, rhinoviruses, and so on. A sexual route, gonorrhea, HIV, and so on. So those ones are usually pretty straightforward. Sometimes we talk about the skin and parenteral route, and they're kind of used synonymously. Technically, parenteral route means through some sort of, there's some sort of jab or something like that. So that could mean a needle injection. It could mean insect bite. It could mean thorn, that kind of thing, something that's actually jabbing it into you. Whereas the skin route is usually often kind of just talking about there's an actual, you already have a scratch or a crack or a break or a hair follicle or something like that, right? And so, like I said, a lot of diseases can get in that way. Staphylococcus, a good example, getting through breaks of the skin. Parenteral route sometimes leads to bloodborne infections. So, for example, you could have an insect that is bringing plasmodium and malaria to somebody through that route. So, like I said, the organism has to get in somehow. And most organisms have preferred methods of getting in, meaning that, this is the way that they're usually getting in and causing disease. People don't usually get malaria from eating contaminated water or food, for example. They're often getting it through that mosquito bite. It is possible also through blood transfusion, but that's not the typical route. Another route is through the placenta. There are some organisms that can actually travel from mother to fetus during pregnancy. There's an acronym for this, and I'll show you a more complex acronym in a moment. I think I have it on the next slide. But an old acronym is TORCH, right? So TORCH, T is for toxoplasma, O is for other. So other, of course, means a whole bunch of things, like Zika would be under other because there's no Z in TORCH. R is for rubella, T-O-R. C is for cytomegalovirus. And I can never remember what H is for. It might be herpes simplex. Let me see what I have here. No, sorry, H is for, H is for herpes simplex 2, right? So herpes simplex 2 is causing herpes, right? Those ones are known to go from mother to fetus during pregnancy. There are quite a few organisms that can go from mother to child, not necessarily in the placenta, but may happen during childbirth. But those ones that I mentioned, toxoplasma, rubella, syphilis is under other, of course. Those three and Zika is a newer one, are really famous for causing deformities and sometimes stillborns during pregnancy. And so I think I mentioned before in class that before the rubella vaccine was out, that was a huge fear of pregnant mothers, to be exposed to somebody with rubella. Rubella is also known as German measles because it could cause deformities and stillbirths. And so when the rubella vaccine came out, that was kind of a huge relief for pregnant women, of course. I'll show you another acronym. This one was proposed a little bit later after the torches, and this is including all diseases, or trying to include a whole bunch of diseases that can go from mother to child. Like I said, not all these are the placental route. A number of these are during childbirth. So HIV, for example, very rarely goes through the placenta. The hugest risk is during childbirth when the water breaks and all that for the mother to give it to the child. Now with antiviral medications, we can minimize HIV transmission during childbirth quite well in many cases. But you can see there's a whole bunch of diseases up there, and this cheap torches kind of tries to cover a whole bunch of them. Of course, there's other on there, and other would include Zika, which is, like I said, really only been on the radar for a few years now for most people. But you can see we still have the other ones in there, toxoplasma. I didn't know about chickenpox and shingles, but I guess it's on there, and don't know too much about that one. So like I said, most organisms have kind of preferred portable entry because, of course, they're usually infecting certain body systems. And so if they're not going in that route, they're not necessarily going to cause disease. So you can see I have two examples there, right? Salmonella is typically a digestive disease. If it gets in the blood, it can be pretty bad too. But generally, you're looking at some sort of, fecal oral kind of route or contaminated food or water or something like that, right? If it's on your skin, not usually causing you any issues, right? No disease. Streptococcus pneumonia can cause pneumococcal pneumonia disease, right? And so gets in the lungs. That's a problem. But if you eat it, there's not usually any disease. So this is true for a lot of organisms, right? They're specialized for fulfilling certain niches and capitalizing on certain tissues. And if they're not getting to that place, they're not necessarily going to cause disease. The kind of exception is Staphylococcus aureus, which seems to be able to infect almost every single body system. It's just very good at being very, very versatile, unfortunately. Oops. So A is portals of entry. B is the number of organisms. If you get one pathogenic E. coli in your glass of water, not really a big deal. Your body can deal with that. If you get 2, not a problem, and so on, right? Most pathogenic E. coli, the ones that cause you like traveler's diarrhea, you need maybe about 1 million cells in order to give you traveler's diarrhea. Kind of gross, right? I think you have to drink that much contaminated water in order to get traveler's diarrhea, right? But that's not true for all pathogenic E. coli. E. coli 0157, we're going to talk about a little bit later today, is one of the nastier E. colis. And it's the one that causes bloody diarrhea and is associated with contaminated beef and whatnot. And we'll talk about that a little bit later today. And the infectious dose for that is about 100 cells. And so you can see that is obviously a much more nasty pathogenic organism. By the way, this number we're looking at here, this ID50, stands for infectious dose 50. And so that's an experimental number that people determine using usually animals. Usually we're not using humans. But it's kind of the number of organisms that will make 50% of the animals sick, right? So it's usually a good measure of what an infectious dose is. You can see some other diseases up there, like cholera, for example. We're looking at thousands to maybe millions of cells to make people sick. Again, the water has to be relatively contaminated before people actually get sick. Inhalation anthrax and so on. And you can see up there a couple of viruses, right? Papillomavirus causing warts, 10,000. Norovirus, 20 viruses. Norovirus, I keep talking about here and there. We're going to talk about a little bit later, as well. I think I called it, did I call it the 2-bucket flu yet? No? So just think for a second. 2 buckets, right? We got 1 on each end. Right? Norovirus, most people will get it once in a while. It really sucks. You don't want it. Pretty serious vomiting and diarrhea. Usually lasts about 24 to 48 hours. Sometimes it's a 1 puke flu or something. Sometimes people call it. I remember having it. I think I had it years ago, and I remember just feeling really gross for about 4 hours until I finally threw up, and then I was done, thankfully. But the person I got it from was sick for about 2 days. It's famous for cruise ships and things like that. It is extremely infectious. 20 infectious particles can cause illness, and it does not get killed by hand sanitizer. The virus particles tend to be very sticky, so it spreads really well. There's a few viruses out there. You can see smallpox and Ebola. The infectious dose may be 1 virus particle. This is like really scary, which is another reason why those diseases are terrifying. I actually forgot to look to see if they can figure out what the infectious dose is for the coronaviruses. I never actually looked up that data, but maybe I'll look that up sometime. So they get access to the body. They get there in large enough numbers, and the next thing they have to do is somehow maybe attach. And we've kind of talked about some of these attachment mechanisms a little bit here and there already. Particularly the parasites, it's easy to imagine these, they've got suckers and hooks, and some of the worms have heads that they're grabbing onto things. We talked about bacteria, things like pili and glycocalyx. Remember, pili are proteins. And so if you've ever had a bladder infection from E. coli, not all E. coli have that particular pili that can attach to bladder epithelial cells. It's actually only a few different strains. And so that's unfortunately part of the luck, is that or unluck, I guess, that you have been colonized by the type of E. coli that can actually attach to bladder cells. That's why some people get them more frequently than others, because you're colonized by the right or the wrong strain of E. coli. There's other things like we talked about glycocalyx. Glycocalyx, like capsules and slime layers, those are carbohydrates. They tend to be sticky. They also help to attach to things. Some things are called adhesions. Adhesions is just a fancy name for other proteins that allow bacteria to attach to things. So you can see there's E. coli on a human bladder cell. I think I have some pictures of some other things. So there's some glycocalyx. That image on the left is actually a Streptococcus attaching to a tonsil cell. So without the glycocalyx, without that capsule, it actually can't cause strep throat. And there's been numerous animal studies showing this type of thing, that you can genetically mutate them so they don't make that carbohydrate, and then they don't actually make the animal sick. And so it's part of one of its virulence factors, as we call it. There's some suckers and some hooks. I think I had mentioned before that this is often a way to identify the exact species of a lot of these tapeworms, as to take a look at their heads, because they tend to have all sorts of unique structures. And I don't know, every time I look at these, I just imagine something out of a science fiction movie. And I actually saw Dune the other day, and it looked like a giant parasite, the big worm that comes out of the sand, and kind of cool anyway. All right, so they've arrived, right place, right numbers. They can attach. One of the other things they need to do is sometimes they need to gain access a bit more to certain tissues and evade immune responses. And those kind of things are sort of related, because sometimes evading the immune response means you're hiding, let's say, inside a cell or something like that. So some of the things we talked about, apical complexes. So an apical complex is found on some protists. And so 3 protists that we talked about were the Plasmodium, that causes malaria, Toxoplasma, which causes toxoplasmosis, and Cryptosporidium. And all 3 of these have this apical complex. And it's a structure that's found on the cell, and it has enzymes and mechanical means of basically burrowing in and hiding inside a host cell. And so all of these can cause intercellular disease, meaning they're hiding inside a host cell, and when they're hiding there, the immune system can't find them. And so all of these were in the group called Apical Complexa. That's not the only thing that are found out there. There's all sorts of enzymes and virulence factors that fall sort of in this category of what we call invasins. So anytime you see IN on the end of something, it usually means it's a protein of some sort. It's just sort of and usually there's a descriptor at the front. So invasin means a protein that helps things to invade. So you can see on that little diagram there, right? It's showing, it says, Listeria, for example, has these invasive proteins. And there's a whole bunch of them. It's kind of not worth going into all of them in terms of all the mechanisms that allow that to do so. But Listeria, for example, has a protein that stimulates phagocytosis in the host cell. And we're going to talk about phagocytosis, I think, next lecture. That basically means that's a way that a cell will use its membrane to engulf food. So Listeria is saying, hey, I'm food, bring me in. And then, of course, it tricks the cell into becoming intercellular infection. Salmonella, I think, does something similar. And like I said, there's all sorts of different mechanisms out there. And this is part of what a lot of microbiologists do for a living in terms of trying to understand these mechanisms and to find out whether we can use therapies to prevent them or stop them and those kind of things. There's a picture. This is from, I think this picture was on the first edition of our textbook, and it's Treponema, which is the organism causes syphilis. And it has a bunch of exoenzymes that they're basically enzymes that destroy tissue and helps it to kind of burrow into various tissues. So syphilis, just like Lyme disease, starts off in one area of the body and can spread and can be very serious if it's left untreated. It can eventually spread to the heart and the brain and those kind of things, which is a bad thing, obviously. Another enzyme that we already talked about were the hemolysins. Remember the hemolysins, we talked about hemolysis as a mechanism for looking at and recognizing different types of organisms such as the Streptococcus. And so we talked about alpha, beta, and gamma hemolysis. So the beta hemolysis was the full hemolysis, and it basically meant they had enzymes that break open red blood cells. And this is a way to invade tissues, right? And this is a way to get at the nutrients, which is really what the organism wants. So it falls into the same category. There's another enzyme. Like I said, there's a whole bunch of examples of these in the textbook. I'm just trying to touch on ones that we have talked about and showing you a few other examples. So here's Staphylococcus aureus, and it has a coagulase, which is causing breakdown of a blood clot, right? And so sometimes that's a mechanism for trying to deal with things that are in our body, like say we get a puncture or a wound or a scratch, we have a blood clot, and then generally the immune cells come along and they try to clean things up. Staphylococcus is an enzyme that can dissolve that clot and then help it to cause infection. I'm going to skip that one there. I'm going to skip that one there. So other examples there in the PowerPoints, you can take a look at them. And like I said, a whole bunch more examples in the textbook. I think there's a giant table, if I remember correctly. Kind of part and parcel of this category is also the evasion of the immune response. So hiding or finding a way to be slippery regarding the immune system. So those capsules, we were just talking about capsules and slime layers, and they're good for being sticky and attaching to surfaces like your tonsils in the case of strep throat. But they're also very good for being slippery when it comes to immune cells trying to grab onto you. So here's an example of Streptococcus. There's the Streptococcus Pyogenes that can cause strep throat. There's also Streptococcus Pneumonia that can cause pneumonia. And they have, the pathogenic versions have these capsules. And these capsules are slimy. And like anything slimy, it's hard to grab onto them. So you can see in that picture there, you've got this phagocyte, that's a white blood cell. It's trying to grab onto the pathogen and it can't, right? And so this is a great way to evade the immune system. So lots of organisms, both gram-positives and gram-negatives, can have capsules. You can see I have an example there of a gram-positive and a gram-negative. They tend to be a little bit more common in gram-positive pathogens, but not, like I said, it's not necessarily a hard and fast rule. Another way to evade the immune response is to change your surface structures so that the immune system can't recognize you. So the example we talked about already way back, we talked about influenza. We had that genetic drift where it slowly mutates from season to season. And that is a strategy for the organism to continue to be virulent. Because if the immune system can't recognize it fully, then it means that it can still infect. And in the case of influenza, it's kind of a slow mutational kind of process, and that's what's been happening with the coronaviruses lately. You know, we've got these new variants, and we're trying to understand, you know, in terms of how infectious or whether our immune system is still recognizing them. And that's why we're still calling them variants, because it seems that, you know, they're not different enough, and our immune system is mostly recognizing them, even if it's still like maybe less efficiently. It's not too bad if you have immunity. But there are some organisms that actually have molecular mechanisms for changing their antigens, so changing their surface structures all the time. And Plasmodium is one organism that is very good at that. I'm not going to get into all the mechanisms, but it actually has genetic mechanisms for randomizing its surface glycoproteins. And so this is why people who live in malaria endemic zones get it again and again and again. Eventually, though, you do start building up some immunity to malaria. So people who live in the malaria endemic zones who get it as adults, it's not a big deal. It's more, like I think I'd mentioned before about Plasmodium, it's more serious for kids who don't have a little bit of built-up immunity. We're trying to figure it out. Plasmodium immunity is a really fickle thing. There's actually the very first malaria vaccine has just been approved by the World Health Organization. And I think it's only about 45% effective, right? But it's better than nothing, right? Like I said, it's a really fickle thing. They're changing up their antigens all the time. They have a genetic mechanism for doing it. It's actually very interesting. Yeah, there have been other experimental Plasmodium vaccines that have been out there. There was one that was invented a few years ago that had to be taken intravenously. So how do you administer that? You got to give everyone an IV. It just wasn't practical, right? And there were a few others that they were able to make that were like super expensive. I was reading about one where they were able to culture a certain stage of the parasite in mosquitoes. So they actually had trained technicians to dissect mosquitoes, and it was something like $10,000 a dose. So again, trying to find, and so this new one that's approved, actually I haven't looked up how it's manufactured, but I imagine it's much cheaper. And it's probably intramuscular injection would be my guess. But, those are some of the hurdles, right? Another way to hide from the immune system, or another way to evade the immune system, is to hide. Hide inside a cell, right? Because if you hide inside the host, that's one way that the immune cells can't find you. A whole bunch of organisms do this. I think I already mentioned some already. Listeria, Plasmodium can get inside red blood cells, and so on. Here's a bunch of other ones, that can live inside of cells. And like I said, it's a great way in order to hide. And it at least slows down the immune system's ability to find you, recognize you, and destroy you. And some of these things exclusively live intracellularly. Some of them have kind of, different stages of their life cycle. And like I said, it's a strategy to hide and reproduce and, maybe go on and infect somebody else, unfortunately. Okay, so at this point, if you think about it, we've the organism has entered the body, and it's entered in large enough numbers. It's been able to attach or evade the immune system. And at that point, really what you have is an infection, but not necessarily do you have disease. And so this is, where we're talking about getting to disease, which is usually some sort of disease could be defined as an abnormal state of the body. Usually it means some sort of damage or discomfort or something like that to your tissues, your cells, or whatnot. And we kind of often break these into two categories. I could add a third category on there in terms of immune reactions, which I've been meaning to add for a while. It's kind of, they don't include it in the textbook, but it is important. I guess we sort of cover it when we talk about the immune system. But you can see we're breaking this into two categories: cytopathic effects and cytological effects. So cytopathic effects really just mean where you have a virus and the virus is literally destroying cells. So if you've had the flu and you've had a cough, that is the influenza virus that is literally destroying cells down your respiratory system, right? And depending on how deep you get that virus, it might be a mild cough, or it might be a much serious cough, including chest pain, right? So that's literally the virus destroying those cells. If you have, I think I have some pictures here. Right, so if you have herpes simplex, so if you have cold sores or genital herpes, you're getting blisters, and those blisters are literally from that virus is basically damaging cells in the lytic cycle, and those cells are turning into a blister, which is leading to discomfort. Right? Ebola is famous for sometimes, they sensationalize it in the news about some people basically bleeding out. And that's really what's happening, is that virus is nasty and that it's damaging multiple tissue systems. Most people that does not happen to, by the way, with Ebola. But there can be bleeding internally and whatnot, which is the virus replicating, destroying cells, and so on. So there's lots of examples of this, and lots of viruses in particular. That's why they are causing disease in certain body systems, because they're attacking tissues in those body systems, right? And that's what's leading to actual disease. And this is called cytopathic effects. I don't exactly know why this term is used for viruses only, not really sure. But when we start to talk about things like bacteria and parasites, we start to talk about cytological effects. And a lot of these cytological effects are caused by some of the same mechanisms, the organism destroying tissues. And in many cases, we're talking about toxins. And we've already talked about toxins a little bit. Kind of want to expand our discussion about toxins. If you remember, I talked about two types: endo and exotoxins. So endotoxins, endo means in, right? And so these are usually part of the organism. There are several endotoxins. Again, this is something, there's a big, long table in the textbook. Usually when people talk about endotoxins, they mean the endotoxin. And the endotoxin is part of gram-negative membrane, outer membrane. Remember, gram-negatives have two membranes. The outer membrane has LPS, lipopolysaccharide, in it, and that lipopolysaccharide is it's a molecule that's unique to gram-negative organisms. And so the scenario where I think I'd mentioned this before, somebody has, let's say, a bloodborne infection, let's say it's E. coli, and the immune system or antibiotics kills the cell, and it breaks open, and the cell parts are all over, and one of those cell parts are the endotoxins, the lipopolysaccharide. And the immune system looks at that and realizes this is not a human molecule. We should do something about it. That's what the immune system is doing. And so it goes into a little bit of overdrive, and that overdrive is something called septic shock. And I think somewhere in the PowerPoints I have some definitions around septic shock and toxic shock, and there's some overlapping concepts. But really this is an elevated immune response. It can lead to things like fever, low blood pressure, and in some cases it can be very serious depending on the severity of septic shock, causing I think organ failure and things like that, in some cases death. So septic shock is something we're very concerned about, particularly with if you're immunocompromised. So elderly people can be quite susceptible to it in the case of bloodborne infections. So in some bloodborne infections, the best route is to actually not necessarily give the person antibiotic, because you don't want to kill these things too fast and release endotoxin. So sometimes treat the symptoms. That's what you do, and slowly let the immune system deal with it rather than shocking the system with too much endotoxin. So usually endotoxin, we do talk about LPS, but like I said, there are other endotoxins. Table in your textbook if you're interested in them, but that's kind of the number one that's talked about 99% of the time. There's a little diagram from the textbook kind of showing you've got a phagocyte, that's a white blood cell. It's mopping up and killing some sort of gram-negative organism, and in the process, the endotoxin is released, gets in the blood, causes the septic shock, which is the concern. So exotoxins are the other type. Exo means out, and these are things that are secreted, and they're usually, we're talking about gram-positives. By the way, there are examples, gram-positive, gram-negatives, in both of these endo and exotoxins. It's kind of just the usual situation, right? Like I've said before, kind of with biology, you can kind of put usually at the front of every sentence, because there's always exceptions, it seems. But there's a lot of gram-positive exotoxins, and some of the most potent ones are gram-positives in terms of their, and I'll talk about some in a moment. Some of these toxins are, they're just kind of like these organisms, they're just trying to find their way in the world. They're just trying to find a place to live. And they're not necessarily trying to damage our system. Sometimes they're just trying to get at nutrients and things like that. Some are waste products. The unfortunate thing is how our bodies react to them. And give you some examples of some exotoxins here now. So there's an exotoxin release there. You can see you've got the exotoxin released by the bacteria, and it's damaging the tissue. So there's a whole bunch there. I was just going to show you this list here. You take a careful look at it. There are some organisms we've talked about, anthrax, I think Clostridium is on there, and so on. I do have some exotoxins examples I want to give you, though, in more detail. So here's one exotoxin. This is the botulinum toxin. And so this is released by an organism called Clostridium botulinum. So this causes botulism, and this is a soil bacterium. So in some ways, this is related to C. diff, by the way. So if you remember, C. diff is a gastrointestinal organism. It's anaerobic. All these Clostridium organisms are anaerobic, and they form endospores. And they all have different toxins, it seems. This one is a soil organism, and can be found, well, it causes botulism. So I think we were talking about it being found in canned food, for example, right? So sometimes, and in certain cultures, people have different practices. There are more cases of botulism in Alaska from some fermenting some fish of some sort, and soil gets in it and so on. So you can see that note there. It says this toxin is very potent, and it prevents the release of a neurotransmitter. So what it does is it paralyzes. So there's your nerve, and if you know a little bit about how nerves work, there's a synapse. That's where the nerve meets the muscle, and you know, there's a little molecule called a neurotransmitter that gets released from the neuron, and that tells the muscle to contract, right? So botulism prevents that. So basically, it blocks that pathway there, right? I think it actually blocks acetylcholine or acetylcholine esterase. I can't remember exactly which one it blocks anymore, but it causes a paralysis. And so in some cases, this can be a local paralysis, or in the case of somebody is ingesting some contaminated food, it can lead to death. So you may have noticed actually from the previous slide, let's take a look at that previous slide for a second. If you look very carefully at the toxin, and if you take a look at my link, right, it says www, something about Wikipedia/Botox. So this is actually the same thing that is commercially known as Botox, this particular toxin. So why is it not killing us? That's the real question. This is the kind of thing that when you search up this toxin, one of the first things you get is celebrity websites, right? You know, who's on Botox? There's Hillary Clinton, for example. When was that? That was a few years ago now, I guess. She ran for election. And, you know, the candidates are old, right? Like, I think Trump at least is in his 70s and Biden is in his 70s. And she was maybe 70 at the time running for president, or 68 or something. I can't remember. And, right, and that's part of the game, right? Whether you're a celebrity or a politician, is, you know, to try to give this idea of youthfulness and those kind of things. And I think it's probably particularly hard being a woman in politics. So I don't blame her for using Botox. So what is going on there, right? How come she's not dead? So it turns out Botox can be used as a very local paralysis kind of thing, right? So if it's used in very, very tiny quantities, it doesn't spread through your blood very well. And you can actually use it for therapeutic reasons. So you can see on the left there, there's that picture of somebody, and there's some people that have these tension headaches. They have, you know, they're for some reason their muscles contract in the wrong places. And so, you know, this particular person here on the left is having this issue, and her eyes and forehead are contracting, leading to severe headaches all the time. And so this is what the therapy actually was initiated for, was to help people with these particular issues. And you can see the woman there, she after the Botox is more relaxed and whatnot. And of course, it didn't take long before people to realize, hey, you know, this seems to be smoothing on a few of our wrinkles. And so now this is like $1 billion industry for celebrities and other people nowadays. Like I said, we're talking about very, very, very tiny quantities. Botox is maybe the most potent toxin on the planet. Apparently 10 kilograms is enough to kill every human on the planet. Right? That's scary. You know, this came out when way back when you know, George W. Bush was in charge, and you may know a little bit of the history of when they went into Iraq and Afghanistan, all that. There was all this issue around weapons of mass destruction, and there was apparently some evidence to say that Saddam Hussein had 10 kilograms of Botox. I don't know if they ever found it. I think there's a lot of controversy about that. But like I said, apparently that's enough to kill every human on the planet, which is very scary. So I don't know exactly the doses are used for Botox, but it's very, very tiny. So here's a related toxin, by the way, the tetanus toxin. In some ways, the structure looks exactly the same. It's a different organism. It's still a Clostridium, still a soil organism. Sometimes tetanus is associated with things like rusty metal. I don't want to call that an old wives' tale, but there's nothing to associate Clostridium with rust. Okay, it's dirt, right? And of course, rusty nails might be in a place that is dirty. So if you do get poked by a rusty nail or something like that, it doesn't necessarily mean you're at higher risk of tetanus than just having a scratch and playing around in the dirt. Not super common, but sometimes people get it. and it gets into their blood and has a toxin. And it's kind of related to the botulinum toxin, but it actually does the opposite effect. So tetanus sometimes is known as things like lockjaw. So rather than causing paralysis, it actually does the opposite. It doesn't allow muscles to relax. So I got a picture here or two. So here's a portrait of a wounded soldier suffering from tetanus, and you can see that the muscles are clenched and they don't want to relax. Apparently it can be quite painful. Again, this is something that nowadays with modern antibiotics, if it's discovered early enough, we can treat it. I don't know if we have any inhibitors for the toxin, but I think that's usually the course of treatment. I've not known anyone who's ever had tetanus. But like I said, anytime that somebody gets poked by something, people always ask, is your tetanus shot up to date, kind of thing. Yeah, so it's, like I said, just kind of another interesting toxin. So this is a picture showing what's going on. You can see that what it's showing is that we have two different types of neurotransmitters, the one that tell your muscles to contract and the other that say relax. And tetanus inhibits the ones that say relax. So there they are blocking it. So there are tons and tons of toxins out there, by the way, and lots of interesting things going on. I just wanted to show you one or two other toxins and kind of just one or two other definitions. So we talked about endotoxins and exotoxins, and sometimes we talk about enterotoxins. So entero or enteric means your gut. So anytime you hear about an enterotoxin, usually it means it's causing diarrhea, by the way. Here's one here. This is Vibrio Cholera. This is also known as an AB toxin, and a bunch of toxins are AB toxins. They're kind of interesting because they have two parts. I'll show you what those two parts do. So one part allows the attachment of the toxin to the tissues, and the other part does the nasty work. So in the case of the cholera toxin, you can see that the B part attaches to the host cell, and the A part activates something called G proteins, which has something to do with osmosis around membranes. And of course, you can imagine if your water balance is messed up, you have more water in your stool, that basically that's diarrhea, right? And that's how it works with cholera. This one here is relatively potent, and apparently, like in some cases of severe cholera, people can actually dehydrate and die from dehydration within something like 10 hours, which is like terrifying. There are a bunch of other toxins that fall into this category. You can see there's the pertussis toxin. Pertussis is whooping cough, the diphtheria toxin, and so on. We're going to talk about diphtheria and pertussis toxins regarding their vaccines. That would be probably next week. And ricin, that is, I saw that somewhere. Trying to think if that was the one that they were trying to isolate in Breaking Bad. Does anyone know? Is that the one? Yeah. So that's the one that comes from, I think it's called the castor bean. And so the whole thing that happened in Breaking Bad, this happens once in a while, right? Where people are trying to buy these castor beans on the internet for that exact reason. And this has been going on long before that TV show. Every once in a while, maybe every 5 years, I read something about the news about the big sting where some guy has collected a bunch of these castor beans and is trying to make the ricin to poison his or her boss or something like that. And there's always a story every few years on this kind of thing. And of course, it had to show up on a TV show eventually. So. So one other category of toxins is also something that we call super antigens. So super antigens are kind of like the endotoxin in that they tend to activate the immune response in a really bad way. The most famous one is this one here, the Staphylococcus aureus TSST1 toxin. I don't know if that stands for toxic shock. Probably Staphylococcus is my guess, right? You can see it's sort of in there in the abbreviation. And this is the one that's most commonly most commonly associated with toxic shock syndrome. So you might be familiar with toxic shock syndrome, particularly if you use tampons, and there's the big warning label on the box, and it's talking about, you know, there is a risk using tampons and toxic shock syndrome, and but you don't have to be a user of tampons to get toxic shock syndrome. You just have to have the wrong Staphylococcus infection. There is more of a risk with tampons, and particularly they noticed this kind of thing, I think it was in the 1980s, when there were some new super absorbent tampons that, this sounds horrifying, but they were the type of tampon that apparently you could leave in for 2 or 3 days, perhaps the entire duration of your period. Horrifying, right, to think about that. And so think about what's happening here, right? You have a device, it's collecting blood, and now you have basically a blood culture. And that's exactly what was happening. And so with these high absorbency, long keep-in tampons, they suddenly noticed a spike, and there were more women getting toxic shock syndrome. It's relatively rare. Like I said, it's not necessarily meaning you have to be a tampon user to get this. It just means you have to have the wrong Staphylococcus infection. So this toxin is known as a super antigen, and it's a blood infection, can lead to toxic shock syndrome. So toxic shock syndrome is actually more severe than septic shock syndrome, and they have overlapping symptoms. Things like I said, low blood pressure, fever, organ failure, and can be quite severe. And like I said, I don't want to get into all the particularities there in terms of the molecular mechanisms, but it's just important to know that what you're looking at is a massive immune response when the immune system recognizes this particular antigen. Usually, when the class is a lot fuller, there's 1 or 2 gaffes. When I mentioned the concept of having a tampon in for that long. Like I said, it's kind of horrifying in some ways. So I want to kind of just talk about pathogenic E. coli for a few minutes. We've been talking about E. coli here and there all semester. And I think I showed you this exact slide before in terms of what is going on. And often E. coli are kind of grouped into 3 categories in a sense, right? You've got one group that are sort of benign, non-pathogenic organisms, commensals. I mean, they could maybe cause disease if they got into the wrong body system. You know, if you, you know, had some, let's say, an intestinal puncture and it got into your blood, that would be bad, obviously, and things like that. We have some that are potentially pathogenic, and those often include the ones that cause urological diseases, so bladder infections and things like that. And then we have some that are definitely pathogenic. So what is kind of the difference here between, you know, groups A and B and then the ones in red, the definitely pathogenic ones? That's what I want to talk about now. So by the way, you know, I'll talk about some of these in a little bit more detail in a minute, but kind of the main infections with E. coli are those gastrointestinal ones, and these are the ones that you hear about all the time in the news. Like if you Google E. coli and you click that news feed tab, you're almost always looking at somebody getting sick from contaminated, you know, Brussels sprouts or whatever, right? It does not represent all of E. coli, but like I said, that's kind of the one that gets most of the news. Kind of maybe the number 2 is the urinary tract infections. But E. coli, it's one of those organisms, if it gets in the wrong place, it can cause a number of other diseases. There are E. coli pneumonias, meningitises, and all those kind of things, even though they're relatively rare. But the main pathogenic ones that we talk about a lot are these categories here. And I'm not going to expect you to remember all of these acronyms. You can see there's UPEC and EPEC, and you know, the EC is E. coli, and then the other things mean something else, right? So enteropathogenic. Remember, entero means what? Your gut. Yeah, so diarrhea, right? Enteropathogenic E. coli. Enterohammerragic. Hemorrhagic means bleeding. And there's other acronyms that are sometimes used, and these are kind of the most commonly used acronyms to kind of categorize these E. coli. So I want to just go through some of the examples and show you what's going on and why they're different. So the first one, like I said, is the UPEC. That's uropathogenic, and we're talking about urinary tract infections. There are other organisms that can cause urinary tract infections. For example, gonorrhea is a good example, and so on. But the E. coli that cause urinary tract infections have something called a P. pili or a P. fimbriae. That's a protein that can attach to those tissues, and that's why they can do that. As I mentioned, this is kind of not a common strain of E. coli, but if you do be unlucky enough to have it, you may be somebody who's unlucky enough to have reoccurring bladder infections, which kind of sucks. Sometimes this is called Honeymooners Cystitis, and the reason why it's called that is sometimes women, they may not have bladder infections until they're sexually active. And so if you think about what is going on there, right, in terms of the female anatomy, you've got the vagina, the urethra, and the anus. They are all relatively close anatomically, right? And so sexual activity, of course, allows some more perturbance of those areas and access of the E. coli to go, from the anus to the urethra. So usually it's recommended, and you see this in a lot of women's health magazines and things like that, they recommend to women after sexual activity. It's a good idea to urinate, right? And that idea is to basically flush out any bacteria that may have entered the entrance of the urethra. So anyway, we've been talking about this one quite a bit. I want to talk about the Enteropathogenic E. coli. And there's a whole bunch of these. Like I said, we've got a whole bunch of acronyms here, kind of just describing the different types of these pathogenic E. colis and where they're from and what they're doing. And kind of the main thing to know is that they're causing diarrhea, and they're doing it, and they have different virulence factors. So that's why they end up in different categories. So for example, you can see the first one there, Enterotoxigenic E. coli. It has certain types of enterotoxins, whereas the enteroinvasive E. coli have different toxins, and because they're enteroinvasive, sometimes they cause bloody diarrhea and those kind of things and so on. And sometimes we're talking about, in terms of the sources, are these things coming from contamination from human fecal matter, or are they coming from contamination of animal fecal matter, right? And so, these are the nuances in terms of what scientists talk about a lot, and then the news just calls them all E. coli, right? And that's kind of the thing that bothers me, because E. coli is not always bad, right? But let's talk about some of these and just show you some details in terms of what is going on. If you've ever had traveler's diarrhea, this is the most common cause of traveler's diarrhea is Enterotoxigenic E. coli. And this is the kind of thing that people get, and they go to, often a warmer place, and they drink contaminated water, and you've got diarrhea for a couple of days, and usually that's E. coli. If it's longer than a couple of days, like a week or two, it's probably Giardia, and hopefully by then you've gotten some medical attention. It goes by many names. I saw this poster here calling it Montezuma's Revenge, but traveler's diarrhea, right? This is the kind of thing that I was reading a book a few years ago by a microbiologist, and he was talking about going on these vacations and how many times, you go for a nice walk down the beach, and what do you see? You see a pipe, and what's coming out of that pipe? Human waste. Right? A lot of countries do not have sanitation systems like we do in Canada. Up until recently, actually, we were doing that in some places. Halifax was pretty famous for that, having giant pipes that basically went to the ocean until the federal law, I think it was only 2006, where federal law basically said, okay, we're dedicating some money to have this cleaned up in some places. And but you can see there's the map kind of showing, in terms of the green zone is the places that have better sanitation systems, and you're pretty unlikely to get traveler's diarrhea. More likely in the red zones and somewhat intermediate in the yellow zones. So there's Epec. So Epec, word to the wise, by the way, and you might end up seeing this in your travels as nursing students when you're looking up diseases and things like that. You get some pretty horrifying images. And I was looking for something about Epec and diarrhea and had some pretty horrifying images. So I've been using some more sanitized images. Thought you might like this one. Epec is more of something associated with infantile disease in developing countries. And unfortunately, infantile death. I think it's actually the #5 cause of infantile death in developing countries. So it's pretty serious. In Canada, it's not something we deal with because, again, usually infants are not getting exposed to water and whatnot contaminated by human feces. So it is something that's very important internationally. So EHEC. Enterohammerragic E. coli. This is the one that you should remember. The big one that we talk about a lot in the news is the the 0157H7. So you can see that there. This one is not associated with human feces. This one is associated with animal feces. And fortunately, it's associated with cows. And we have a pretty intimate relationship as humans with cows. We eat them. We get milk from them. And their manure is used to fertilize many of our crops. And here's the thing, is that the cows don't get sick. They harbor the organism in their gut. Some studies show that maybe half the cows out there have this organism in their gut. And so when we discovered that, actually that wasn't that long ago. It was only 20 years ago that some of these studies were done. And we realized that this was a pretty chronic issue, that cows had this particular organism. And so this actually led to, in Canada anyway, a lot of changes in slaughterhouse practices and trying to minimize, fecal contamination of meat and things like that. And just yet another reason why we should cook our meat, I suppose. But it does happen sometimes that the manure does end up getting into and contaminating, vegetables and things like that. So I keep talking to you guys about this romaine lettuce issue of, what was that, maybe 2 years ago. And in that case, it was some manure was being used to fertilize a field, and there was some flooding, and the flooding took that manure into the romaine lettuce field, right? So generally what happens with something like romaine lettuce, where we're eating the lettuce directly, we're not fertilizing that with manure that can get into it. But in this case, it was a flooding that caused it to be spread into that field and then end up in that contamination, which is a pretty common kind of route of infection. Going to say something else about this. This is the one, by the way, that you hear about in the news a lot that people are super concerned about because it's enterohammerragic, which means it can cause bleeding and actually death and kidney damage. And so people who are particularly young or old or immunocompromised are most susceptible. So what is it about EHEC that is particularly nasty? It has all sorts of toxins. I'm not going to get into all the details of what these toxins do. One of the weirdest things that these toxins do is allow these organisms to bind, and they actually form these pedestals. So they don't just dock on the edge of a cell. They actually reshape the cell and make themselves a little throne, right? And you can see that in this diagram here. It's actually a really interesting phenomenon. Maybe it's a little bit better to call that throne a toilet, because literally what they're doing is they're dumping their toxins into that cell and eventually killing that cell, and that's leading to the bloody diarrhea. There's a little video there I was going to play, but I think I'm going to skip that just in terms of keeping ahead on time. The other thing I wanted to mention about 0157 is that this became very famous 20 years ago in Walkerton. And I'm still hearing about Walkerton in the news. I was living in Ontario at the time, and it was a huge deal where there were a whole bunch of people in Walkerton who ended up getting sick. I can't remember the exact number now from E. coli 0157, I think, and there were a number of deaths as well. And this was a case where you had a small town, and there was flooding, and that led cow manure to get into the town reservoir. And kind of the big scandal around this was that the people in the water treatment plant doing the testing were basically just recording inaccurate results, and they're in jail because of that, right? because it led to the deaths of a number of people and quite a bit of severe illness. So here's from the textbook talking about different types of E. coli illness. You can take a look at that. It's talking about all sorts of different diseases, infections, kind of all summarized in one slide. Like I said, we're looking at mostly urinary tract infections in some cases, and then various types of gastrointestinal infections. It can be normal diarrhea, could be bloody diarrhea, could be from animal feces, could be from human feces, and you know, kind of just depends on the circumstance. But really kind of the three to remember for this class is the traveler's diarrheas from human feces, usually only lasts a couple of days. The bloody diarrhea, the EHEC 0157 E. coli is the one that we're most concerned about, causes bloody diarrhea and can lead to kidney failure and very severe disease. That's from usually cow manure. And then I guess the urinary tract infections. Those are kind of the three E. coli infections that are the most important to know for this class. Okay, kind of the last part of this is that these organisms, in order to cause disease, you know, this kind of brings us back to the beginning. Usually they have to exit the body to make it to another individual. And in a lot of ways, these are the same as the portals of entry, right? Sometimes, you know, with the gastrointestinal system, the portal of entry is, you know, usually the mouth, but the portal of exit is, of course, the anus. But it's the same body system, right? And so this is kind of the last part of the piece, right? In terms of, you know, if it's going to cause further infection, it's got to get transmitted. And that brings us back to some of the earlier concepts we were talking about last week in terms of disease transmission and so on. Okay, so the key concept here is there's quite a number of variables that are important for infection and disease. And it's important to know a little bit about all of these. These are the kind of things that, you know, in the final exam, you know, and so in the fill in the blank section, there's some good questions there, right? I could ask you about, you know, for example, you know, what are some ways that, you know, list 3 ways that organisms might evade the immune system, or describe 2 portals of entry with examples, or, you know, something like that. So I know there's a lot of information here. Make sure you go through each of these and learn, you know, and kind of an example for each of these things, A, B, C, D, all the way to F, at a minimum. And I'll try to talk a little bit more about this when we do our review for the final exam. Okay. So I want to finish this topic off and just kind of talk about stages of disease. One thing that's been talked about a lot with the coronavirus is the incubation period. So this is the time when we get infected by the pathogen. So it's got in there, it's bound, it's maybe evaded the immune system, but there's no signs and symptoms yet. This can vary dramatically for some diseases. Here's a chart from the textbook. I added COVID-19 in there. COVID-19 is like 2 to 14 days. This has kind of been the big problem with this pandemic, right? In that it has a long incubation period, a long time where 2 things, right? A person is infected and they're infectious before they show symptoms. Not all diseases are like this, right? And some are a lot easier to control because a person might have a short incubation period, they're not necessarily infectious. But you can see a bunch of examples there. All right, and so this is something we talk about a lot when we're talking about infectious disease. So the other stage of disease, we have, you know, it gets in there, and sometimes it starts giving symptoms because it's destroying tissues, or sometimes there's an immune response related in there, and usually there's a peak in the symptoms, and things either get better or, unfortunately, there's death, right? And I'm not going to go into all the details on this. There's a whole bunch of information in the textbook on it. But what I want you to do is take a look in the notes, and there's some examples of different definitions around disease. So acute versus chronic, things like that are good to know. I was going to show you this here. I found this. There's a whole bunch of these on the internet. This is the stages of disease for COVID-19. And this is something we talked about a little bit already in terms of some of the things going on in the body. So you can see it's talking about incubation period, 2 to 14 days. And generally, a person could be asymptomatic in that incubation period. And so it's also showing, I like this diagram because it's talking about some of the therapies that might be effective at the different stages of the disease. So in the first week after the incubation period, people have the viremia, the cytopathic part of the disease. So some people are getting, coughs and difficulties with breathing and, other respiratory symptoms. And that's from the disease, from the organism replicating in the respiratory system. The organism can also replicate in the circulatory system. And so there's all sorts of other weird things that are going on with people. I don't know if you guys have heard of what's it called? COVID toes. Some people are getting rashes all over the feet. Some people are having blood clots. There's a whole variety of symptoms. This virus seems to replicate, like I said, in the vascular system, which is a big deal. Usually after about a week, the immune system starts to clear the virus, but people are ending up with longer symptoms, and these are inflammatory symptoms. So that means the immune system is causing all sorts of issues, right? So that can lead to things like fluid in the lungs, extreme fatigue, and all sorts of other things. And this is where antivirals aren't going to do any good anymore. Now we're talking about treating people with steroids and things like that. And we're even starting now to talk a lot about long COVID, meaning people that have symptoms that last longer than a couple of weeks and can be, in some cases, several months. And part of that is just due to all that collateral damage that's happened, partly from the immune response and chronic disease. The virus is long gone, of course, but people are still living with the consequences. Oh, there was another one I found on COVID and showing that, kind of some of the differences between people that have mild COVID and severe COVID. I'm not going to get into that, but you can see that really the severe COVID, you're looking at elevated responses and also longer duration of the responses as well. Okay, so it's obviously much more complex than this in terms of disease, right? There's all sorts of diseases that we poorly understand. I mentioned cholera and giardia are good examples of diseases that cause diarrhea. But if I were to give everyone a glass of water here that had giardia in it, I think the stat is somewhere a third to half of us would get severely ill, and the rest of us would be just fine, right? Same thing with cholera. So what is going on there? There's a lot of little nuances we don't understand in terms of a lot of these diseases. Things like age and gender, genetics, diet, all these kind of things can affect our health and our susceptibility to diseases. Obviously, how our immune system is doing on that particular day, whether we're on immunosuppressants and those kind of things can really make a huge difference. People with complicating factors like diabetes can get a lot more severe disease, for example, from COVID versus a regular person and so on. So like I said, it's a lot more complex than it's painted. So like I said, that's kind of it for this unit in terms of there's a lot of definitions there. I know in the notes about different kinds of disease and symptoms versus signs and things like that. I'm not going to be testing you on that. They're just there for definitions to give you guys the language to understand some of the things that we're talking about here. So I have about 5 minutes left. I want to do just a very quick introduction to the immune system so that next day we can kind of dive right into it. Okay, I'll just see if there's any questions on the Zoom here. All good. Okay, so like I said, a very quick introduction to the immune system. The immune system, I've broken it up into basically 3 lectures, part 1, part 2, and part 3. All these sections are kind of intertwined in terms of some of the things that are going on, but it's a decent way to kind of break things up in terms of what's going on with the immune system. So let's talk about the immune system. Oh, come on. First thing to say about the immune system is it's very complex. We're going to have a hard time really kind of touching on all the nuances of the immune system in basically 3 lectures. And so there's a lot of stuff we're going to skip. You can see this is talking about all of the things the immune system has to do, right? It's got to communicate, it's got to fight worms, cause inflammation, it's going to kill infected cells, it's going to kill cancer cells, it's going to recognize enemies, try not to recognize itself, and there's at least 20 types of immune cells, probably a lot more. You know, this was just a list I made quickly. Each of these cells has multiple jobs, and you can imagine what this is like, right? It's like a government. It's super complex. There's a little video you can check out on YouTube that talks about the immune system, and I love how it sort of talks about at the beginning about all these jobs and complexity and all the things that are going on in terms of what's going on in the immune system. And this is the thing with you know, COVID-19 that kind of has bothered me a lot, where people seem to, you know, think they know how an immune system works. You know, oh, I had it once, I'm fine, right? Well, immunity is so complicated. You know, COVID-19 is not like chickenpox. This is a whole new virus, right? Which means we have a whole new set of rules in terms of how immunity works. And actually, there's a lot we're still learning about it. So some of these things I'll touch on in the next couple of lectures in terms of, you know, what is going on with immune memory and things like that. So if we look at the immune system, I'm going to break the immune system into really 2 or 3 parts, and these are going to be covered over 2 lectures. So the first part is innate immunity. So what do I mean by innate immunity? I mean, this is what you're born with, right? This is what is there. Requires no training, no memory cells, nothing like that. This is just what's there. And the number 1 part of that innate immune system is the skin. So that's just a barrier that is preventing things from getting in. And so it also includes things like the mucous membranes and your normal microbial flora, all of those things that are physically just blocking organisms from getting in and access to our tissues. So I call that the first line of defense, meaning it's kind of just there, and it's actually a pretty good line of defense. Think about it, if you didn't have your skin, we would be in serious trouble in terms of getting infections. So more on skin next day. Also part of our innate immune system is something we call chemical defenses or cellular defenses, meaning these are usually chemicals in the blood or the body tissues or sometimes certain types of cells. And these include some types of white blood cells that are kind of like little watchdogs. They're crawling around your body just looking for things that are not human, cleaning up messes, and alerting the rest of the immune system if there is some trouble. This includes processes like inflammation and fever and the complement system and so on, and we're going to cover some of these next day. So this is all innate immunity. This is stuff, like I said, that you're born with. It's ready to go. It's not specific, but it's generally quite fast, right? Your skin is there right now. There's no delay time. The skin is ready to go. There's chemicals in it already that are there to help you with your immune system. And then we're going to talk about adaptive immunity. So adaptive immunity is a thing that a lot of people think about when they do talk about the immune system, how we have memory cells and how you get infected, and then next time you have a bit of immunity or good immunity and so on. And this involves specialized cells. And we've already talked about antibodies, and these specialized cells are making antibodies. These are called B cells and T cells and some very complex mechanisms. And we're going to cover things like talk about vaccination and other types of long-lived immunity that can occur as a result of these kind of cells. So this was kind of where I wanted to finish today. So I think we're in good shape. We'll kind of come back, and next lecture is going to be 13-1, where we're going to talk about innate immunity and the skin and a bunch of other things. So thank you guys for coming. Good luck on your midterm, and we'll see you next day.